And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Democrats are celebrating what they were able to accomplish during the 105-day session on topics ranging from police reform to climate change to the budget and taxes. But minority Republicans have quite a different view of things. Joining me now to offer their review of the 2021 session are Senate Republican leader John Braun and House Republican leader J.T. Wilcox. Welcome to the program. Good to see you both.
Thanks for having us, Austin.
Likewise, thanks for having us.
Let me start with you, Senator Braun. Just a 30-second review, brief overview of how you felt the session went from your perspective, from where you sit.
I would say overall, tough session, very partisan. You know, the majority came with a clear agenda, and we got some stuff done. We advocated for reopening businesses. We advocated for getting our kids back in school and had some success there. We influenced the budget to some degree, and we can talk about where we did, but overall it ended up much too large and reliant on taxes we frankly didn't need. And then of course there was the broader tax discussion, the capital gains income tax, these regressive carbon tax policies, and then other important stuff like police reform and the Blake decision that really didn't get a bipartisan effort. It was not allowed by the majority. So a ton of things happened in the last 105 days, many of which I don't think will be good for the citizens of the state of Washington long term. Mostly pleased we're done, but we can't do any more harm.
Representative Wilcox, what's your summation?
Well, I think the depressing part is we started the session with a state of emergency. We end the session with a state of emergency totally unchanged. In fact, extended by a partisan vote in the beginning of the session. We started the session behind fences and wire. We're ending the session behind fences and wire. Those are bad things, and I think we had opportunities to do much better, but we ran into a partisan team that just doesn't want to give up any ground, and I think that's unfortunate. We have a three-branch system of government. The branches should be independent, not in lockstep every moment. We also saw, I think, a horribly regressive agenda that is going to impact middle-class people, working families that just want to live in a place where they can afford the housing and unfortunately have to commute for work and to make a living. And the environmental agenda, I think, is going to crush them. We're talking about increases in the cost of gas when these things are fully implemented of 60 cents a gallon plus, around $10 every time you fill up your tank. That is absolutely not fair, and it's totally at odds with the rhetoric that came out of the majority party. On the plus side, I thought there were a couple of really good groundbreaking bills that we were participants in. First of all, the working families tax credit, which really does look at the regressive nature of how our tax system works. But of course, the impact of that was totally overshadowed by what is going to happen to the cost of commuting if you're a working family that doesn't have the luxury of living right next to your job. And then another thing that isn't being talked about very much, I think by far the most effective environmental legislation that I've seen in quite some time, and that is the wildfire bill that finally, after decades, funds the forest practices that are required to keep our state forests healthy and will have a huge impact on diminishing wildfires in the future. That probably is going to do more to reduce carbon than any of the signature environmental bills that are out there. And it absolutely has a lot to do with public health because of the impact that smoke over time has made on the health of vulnerable people.
So on the one hand, what I hear you both saying is that you feel like this was a very partisan session, and certainly Democrats have firm control and firm grip on both chambers as well as the governor's office. On the other hand, I hear you saying that there were a couple of examples that you can point to of bipartisan wins. We saw in Oregon things have kind of ground to a halt at times. The Republicans there have some tools at their disposal that you don't to slow things down. But at the same time, we didn't see that happen much here at all. I mean, I know that there were a couple of procedural motions on the floor to try to bring bills to the floor. I'd like to hear from each of you kind of your philosophy coming into this session and how you approached this, even though you were very frustrated about the nature of the remote session, even though you disagree with much of the agenda. Did you make a conscious decision to try to not gum up the process? What was your thinking here, Senator Braun?
Thank you, Austin. So, as you say, we don't have exactly the same constitutional options as Oregon does, but more fundamentally, I'd say it was a very purposeful approach. When I stepped into this new role, my challenge to my caucus was don't just be the party of no. If you disagree with what's being proposed, you need to make the argument on why it's not the right policy for the state of Washington, and you need to propose an alternate if that's appropriate. In some cases, the alternate is nothing, and that's a better option for the people. But some cases, it's bad policy and there's better policy. We need to get out there and make an argument and make it clear that we're here to represent the viewpoint, the folks we represent, and we're here to govern effectively. And we do that by being engaged and involved. And we're not surprisingly not going to win a bunch in a fairly deep minority, but we're not going to get back to a majority by just saying no all the time.
Yeah. So, Representative Wilcox, I know that the Lieutenant Governor, Denny Heck, was heaping praise on both sides for the approach and the sort of determination to stick to the business and not make it personal. How did you and your caucus approach this session, and did you have similar or different guidance to your members?
Well, I think actually John and I have very similar approaches in almost everything. And I appreciate what the Lieutenant Governor said, although we're not here to make him happy. We're here to make our constituents happy. And, we do have a very different constitution in Washington compared to Oregon. And I've told people quite a few times, it might be an emotional high to walk out and stop things, but under our rules, that means that the Democrats could legislate anything that they wanted. They could pass any tax they wanted without any opposition, and that wouldn't be serving our constituents very effectively. And the truth is, once you start deploying a tool like walking out, it is really hard to ever stop it. And the trigger for doing it becomes lighter and lighter every time. And you've seen in Oregon, they've gone from occasional walkouts to, walking out on all kinds of issues. And I think I've seen their leadership trying to rein that back a little bit. But, there is a way to address this in our system. Our job is to, after an election, come in for our sessions and do everything that we can to convince the other side to use the rules that are at our disposal to stop the bad things when it's possible. But in the end, the majority wins an awful lot of votes. And then our job and the job of the voters is to decide if they get to continue to be a majority. And so you're going to see John and I and others go out and talk to the public an awful lot about the impact of what's happened. That's the other part of our job. And we're not going to shirk that any more than we would shirk any fight that is our responsibility in the legislature. I don't have any quitters in my caucus. I have seen our people continue to stand up at 2 a.m. when they're tired, when in this context, when their families are sick of hearing them in their back room on Zoom. They're not going to give up. And so we will use all the tools that are legal and available, but we're not going to tear down the institution either. This institution needs to be here and functioning long after John and I and anyone in our caucus are gone.
Okay. Let's talk about the budget. Senator Braun, before you were the Republican caucus, the leader of your caucus, you were the lead Republican budget writer in the state Senate. This was a unusual year in the sense that we're in a recession, and yet revenues rebounded, and at the same time there was unprecedented federal assistance in the form of several relief packages. Also, we saw the House and Senate Republicans put out their own budget proposals, and those proposals were to spend more money than the last budget. So where do you break with the budget that was passed? What is the heartburn you have, again, in that context that you guys were also proposing to increase spending?
Thank you, Austin. So yeah, I'd start by, there's some key things in there that we worked on and really came out of the early full budget proposals of the House Republicans and the House or the Senate Republicans proposed. Things like the working families tax credit that I firmly believe made it over the hump because Republicans led on that issue. The full funding for the forest health program, significant investment in services for developmentally disabled. These are things that came directly out of the budgets we proposed, over two months ago. Another thing that's kind of deep in the weeds, but appeals to budget writers, is a significant payoff of our long-term pension liability, $800 million to pay off the pension liability. So those are some of the good things. But broadly, the challenge I have is we just flat overspent. We have 13% growth in the budget, over double the growth in personal income, and we know that's been a historical issue. So we are long-term growing out of, away from the average earning of folks around the state of Washington. And then the other thing I would really highlight, is the lack of transparency. We got a 1,000-page budget on Saturday afternoon, and the voted it out on Sunday afternoon. And I would be willing to bet there's not many people that, besides the staff that actually wrote it, that have read the whole thing. And I mean, we're literally still going through it. That shouldn't be acceptable. And to their credit, early on in the current majority, they were more transparent. They let the public see it further ahead of time, and they've gotten into bad habits. And that is particularly, I think, egregious in a year like 2021, where there has been a lack of access to folks to see what's going on, to interface directly with their legislators and participate in the process in person. So I would say that's the biggest issues. There's a lot of little stuff in there that I think is wrong, but I don't want to give the impression there's nothing good in there. There are some good things in there, and I think those were done directly as a result of the efforts by our budget writers, the Republican budget writers, to put out a solid, full plan really early in the process.
Representative Wilcox, this is a roughly $59 billion budget, plus there's about $10 billion in federal money that will be used for public schools, public health, rental assistance, ongoing business assistance. What jumps out at you?
Well, I have always felt like the details of the budget are less important than the direction of the budget, and especially the slope of the increase. And so as I have been concerned about every year that I'm here, at some point we're going to reach a budget crisis, and the result is usually a crash that hurts the people that need the help from the state of Washington the most. And this budget is pumped up by a ton of one-time dollars, and some of those dollars were spent in one-time ways. But I think others are standing up programs that are going to be hard to sustain when we don't have those federal dollars coming. And it's true that the feds can print money. We can't. We have a balanced budget requirement, but they're not going to do it forever. And we have to be able to solve that problem when it comes as well. And we've really tried hard, and I think both sides feel this. People forget that Republicans, I think, represent probably the bulk of low-income working families, because poverty has become kind of a rural and suburban phenomenon, not just a city phenomenon. That's where a lot of the wealth is nowadays. And we've done so many things that is going to increase the cost of living for people that in general don't want to be dependent. These are people that want to stand up, raise their family using the resources that are available to them, and they're not always looking for government to help them out. We have to be sure that we're not bailing out one part of the economy and ignoring these folks, but they want to achieve things themselves. And I think those are the people that are getting left behind a little bit now, and especially when we're hearing this constant talk about a regressive tax system and progressive values. I cannot tell you how angry, honestly, I am that many of the actions that I outlined a little bit early are incredibly regressive and are the most painful for people that are working families that have to commute.
And I'll ask you a little bit more about those climate bills in a moment. Let me just touch on the capital gains tax, which has been debated hours on end on the floors of both of the chambers. I'd like to look a little prospectively, though, here. What's going to happen next? I mean, the anticipation is that the governor signs it and that there's a legal challenge. You all have said it's unconstitutional, that it's a form of an income tax. The Democrats are saying it's an excise tax. It seems, almost certain that this is going to be litigated in court. Where do you go from here on the capital gains tax, which they say is aimed at the wealthiest residents in the state and is about right-sizing the tax code that they say is regressive? Representative Wilcox?
Well, first of all, I think it certainly has been shown to be unconstitutional many, many times in the past. It's been tested in the courts over and over and over. And as for it being an excise tax rather than a income tax on capital gains, I could take you out to the farm and point to a chicken and tell you it's a cow, but that doesn't make it a cow. That's just language that they're using. So I am 100% sure it's going to be challenged. I think it's going to be a well-funded and competent challenge, and the courts will have a chance to weigh in. And it's true that in the current form, it does not touch a high percentage of people in Washington. However, the people that it touches, and it touches in a pretty major way, are among the most mobile people in the world. And I think in the end, the result will not be positive for Washington, as people that are motivated by dollars. And we certainly have to concede the other side has had a lot of rhetoric about how motivated by dollars the top earners are. They're going to adjust. And I think we will end up taking in a lot less than we expect. Now, no one, I think, should expect that it's going to remain limited in scope. The governor's budget proposed capital gains income tax that would touch people that made as little as $25,000 a year from that source, which covers an awful lot of retired people. So, the difference between the current $250,000 threshold and that proposed $25,000 threshold, I think, gives us all an idea of where this is likely to go in the future as demands for increased budget, create new needs for revenue. So everybody should be concerned. We should be concerned about the economy, and we will certainly see a challenge. And who knows? I think in spite of the language that was added that I think unfairly prevents a referendum in the long run, there may be sorry, I'm forgetting the other thing, an initiative.
Oh, initiative, yes, right. Yeah, so right, it's the way that the bill is written, it seems to be inoculated from a voter referendum, but potentially there could be an initiative to overturn this tax. Senator Braun, if you were to wager, do you think that this leads to the Supreme Court revisiting whether its previous decisions around a graduated income tax, or do you think that the argument is going to be simply around whether this particular tax is constitutional or unconstitutional?
It's hard to predict with this court. This court has been very willing to disregard long-standing precedents. We saw that this year with the decision. So I think everything is on the table, and that, frankly, is exactly why this was pushed through. Like it was clear we didn't need it. We had, $10 billion of money we didn't expect. We were flush with money. We didn't need an additional capital gains tax, but the goal was to get it in front of the court in the hope that a very left-leaning Washington State Supreme Court will undo 80 plus years of precedent. And that's exactly the reason they went to such extremes to keep in. First was emergency clause, and we were able to pull that out. Then it was a kind of hidden emergency clause or a referendum ban. We pulled that out in the Senate originally too. It was in the intent language, and then it went to the House, and the House Ds put it back in, and they sent it back to the Senate, and then we had a fight right up until the very last day trying to remove that language. The intent was to prevent the voters from having a referendum. I think that is unconscionable that they would go to that extreme. But the reason they were willing to take the political hit for denying the voters the right to weigh in is because they want and they expect that the Supreme Court is going to rule prior to an initiative. At this point, realistically, there's no way to get an initiative in front of the voters until 2022, and that gives time for the Supreme Court to weigh in. And whether they say it's really an excise tax and call a chicken a cow, I can't tell you, but I mean, I think that it's wholly unpredictable based on the recent actions of this very left-leaning Supreme Court.
New topic, and we have a lot to get to and not a lot of time here, so forgive me in advance for not getting to everything, because I know we won't. But this was a mile-a-minute whirlwind session, and it was a whirlwind final weekend. A lot of bills passed, including the low-carbon fuel standard and the cap-and-trade system, both priorities of the governor. Representative Wilcox, you have indicated you think this is going to raise the cost of fuel for people. The governor said it's going to save lives, it's going to create jobs. These are not going to take effect immediately, and they are tied to a transportation funding package. Why, if the governor is saying this is actually good policy, smart policy for the state, progressive policy, why are you saying it's so regressive?
Well, first of all, Austin, why have the voters rejected these things over and over and over? And why did it take Democrats who controlled my chamber for the entirety of the governor's tenure, 9 years now? Why have they never passed these out before? It wasn't because it was tremendous policy that everybody loved. I think the jury is in on this, and until we had this year where there's a tremendous opportunity for because of circumstances and this odd constrained session, these things have always failed. It's true, they're tied to a gasoline tax, and that makes that gas tax even more difficult to pass. Most gas taxes are tied to bonds, and bonds require a supermajority, and that requires Republican votes in both chambers. And I've been supportive of transportation packages in the past, because those are building hard assets that are needed to keep a strong economy, especially in non-urban areas. And I think it's a tragedy that a vote for a transportation bond now will then empower these additional provisions that can add 60 cents or more, that's at the low end of the estimates, to the cost of gas. And, if this is so wonderful, why is it that we keep hearing how we've got to help working families? I cannot understand how you can talk about helping working families at the same time as you do something that is just so devastating to people that want to live in a place that they can afford and don't have a job just around the corner. That's absolutely wrong. And, here's the thing about the carbon part of this. We have had a lot of bipartisan efforts that have addressed the carbon challenge. We have done a lot in the state of Washington to encourage the electrification of transportation. And in general, that's been very bipartisan. I just mentioned the forest practice bill that is going to have a huge impact on wildfires. I wish the feds would be as aggressive as we are in improving the health of forests, which is the major contributor to the wildfires that we have. That was bipartisan. You never hear these environmental wins, and I think it's because they're bipartisan. They're not a good litmus test. You hear about the ones that are deliberately set to be a partisan vote, because that is really good politics for people that are motivated by carbon and environmentalism. And just one other thing I want to say, Austin, transportation is rapidly electrifying. There are manufacturers, it seems like every month, who are announcing to the world and their shareholders that they have a definite end to producing cars that are powered by petroleum. That ship has sailed, and our future transportation system is going to be electrified. And that was mostly the free market that did that. The government gives some marginal kicks, and we have contributed and participated in that as caucuses in the past. But I think the free market has spoken, and that's where we're going.
Okay. Senator Braun, unless you feel compelled to weigh in on this, I'd like to ask you about the Blake decision in the few minutes we have left.
Sure.
Okay. I know your family suffered a tragedy during this session that you spoke very openly about in the context of this decision throwing out as unconstitutional the state's simple drug possession law. The ultimate fix was to make simple possession a misdemeanor and to try to divert people into treatment. And then there will be some effort to come up with a permanent solution over the next 2 years. Why did you end up voting against this, and how did your family's tragedy influence your thinking around this?
Well, thank you, Austin. So I worked really hard on this in the Senate to get something off the Senate floor. As you know, it came off in a very bipartisan manner, and 14 votes from each side of the aisle. And I thought it was just I didn't love everything about it, but I did think it was a much better solution. It got folks into diversion, and gave some leverage to law enforcement and to the prosecutors to keep folks in treatment. I mean, and I would say if there's one thing that tied us together across party lines and across the rotunda is a desire to get folks into treatment. I would say that was very much informed by my personal experience in our family, that you couldn't just hope people showed up in treatment and hope people stayed in treatment. That if you really want to save lives, you have to have some leverage to keep them in treatment until they can beat that addiction. And it's really hard. And I think anybody, and many people have had this experience in their family. Anybody that's seen it knows this is not an easy thing to get by. You need help, and right now the help comes, prior to Blake, the help came largely through drug court, where folks had access to treatment through, as an option from long-term prison time. With a move from a Class C felony to a gross misdemeanor in the Senate, you didn't have the access to drug court, but we spent a lot of time making sure you had access to other treatment. I was very disappointed with what came out of the House. They went from a diversion system to a referral system. To this day, I don't know how that referral system is going to work. There's no arrest. There's no prosecutor involvement. It's basically, we hope you'll go to treatment, or we'll give you a ride down to the treatment, but there's no follow-up, no enforcement. And I frankly think that's going to cost lives. And then the other thing I would point out in the limited time we have is that this all sunsets in 2 years, and it sunsets back to current law, which is full legalization. So they've set the stage. The far left has set the stage to go towards full legalization of hard drugs, personal amounts of LSD in your pocket in the state of Washington. I don't believe that's right. I don't think that's good for our citizens, and I think people will die as a result.
Okay, and I know you did lose your nephew during session, so our condolences to you and your family, Senator Braun. We are out of time. So many more topics to talk about, including the police accountability bills that passed. The Democrats obviously had a great focus on equity this year. Much to have a follow-up conversation about, but unfortunately I do need to wrap it up here. So to the Republican leader, Senator Braun, Representative Wilcox, thanks for your time. Look forward to the next conversation. Thank you for being here.